observers thought maybe he should have been in the country earlier, but he looks fresh so far. Oh, good solid right hand. Caught Kim coming in.
On November 13th, 1982, South Korean boxer Kim Duk-koo was fighting against US champion Ray Mancini. Though America had written Kim off prior to the fight, he had an excellent record of mostly knockout wins. The fight went the distance, and both fighters were bloody and battered. In the 14th round, Mancini caught Kim with a few blows which knocked him down. He managed to climb to his feet again, but the ref called the fight for Mancini as a TKO due to Kim looking very unsteady. A few minutes after the fight, Kim collapsed. He was immediately rushed to hospital where he was diagnosed with massive bleeding in his brain. He was sent to emergency surgery where they tried to relieve the pressure with shunts. 5 days later, Kim was dead. The aftermath of the fight led to Kim's mother drinking a bottle of pesticide and dying in a bout of grief over her lost son. It led to Mancini becoming racked with so much guilt that he was haunted by the fight and he would never be the same fighter again. It also led to boxing creating some rule changes. Title fights dropped from 15 rounds to 12 and new pre-fight medical checks had been introduced to ensure both fighters were fit to fight. To the outside world, it looked as if boxing had woken up to its dangers. But it either didn't know, or didn't care, what the real danger was.
Today there is a new and alarming study about CTE, the most comprehensive yet.
Oh, what a hit, look out. Facey was actually throwing strikes. There's a that is unbelievable!
This is Micky Ward, former light welterweight champion and renowned for some of the most punishing and brutal boxing matches in history. Over his 51 fight career, he amassed 38 wins with 27 by knockout. Ward was a pressure fighter. He'd get right in your face and try to pummel you with shots. This also meant that he was open to hits too. Not that it seemed to matter much because Ward was also blessed with an iron chin. This is Junior Seau, former NFL linebacker, Hall of Famer, and well-respected former athlete. Throughout his punishing NFL career, he tackled 1,849 times. NFL is an extremely physical game. The further back in history you go, the more brutal it was, owing to changes in the rules over time, which stopped people from tackling in particular ways and also introduced more safety equipment. A huge amount of tackles in NFL involve head-on collisions, which is why they wear safety helmets. This is Bob Probert, former professional ice hockey player. Bob was what was known as an enforcer. His job on the rink was basically to intimidate and bully the opposition with his aggressive and very physical style of hockey. Or, if the player was a little resistant to hard checking, he'd just start a fight with them and knock them out instead. Playing for the Detroit Red Wings, Probert once described his job as protecting team captain Steve Yzerman by any and all means necessary. This is Hilderaldo Bellini, former soccer player, Brazilian national central defender, and World Cup winner in both 1958 and 1962. In 58, he was the first ever World Cup winner to lift the trophy into the air, something which he did to give photographers a better view of the trophy. Ever since then, every single World Cup winning team has lifted the trophy in the exact same way. This is Chris Benoit, former professional wrestler, champion at multiple levels. He entertained millions of people all over the world as a competitor in WWE before murdering his wife and son and taking his own life. 5 people from seemingly completely different backgrounds with totally different careers who are all linked together by one thing. That thing, in case you haven't guessed it yet, is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. If you haven't seen the movie Concussion, you should give it a go. It details the story of Dr. Bennett Omalu, a pathologist who assessed the brains of some former NFL players, which revealed a huge risk which had previously not been talked about. Today, we're going to be talking about CTE. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a degenerative brain condition which has some pretty horrifying symptoms which are genuinely the stuff of nightmares, as you'll see. This video is also a look at why we don't know about this condition quite as widely as we should do. Some of the stories you'll see and hear will be quite tragic, and some will definitely challenge your notion of right and wrong and the idea of personal responsibility. If you're not up for being challenged, just don't watch this. CTE has actually been known for a pretty long time. As far back as the 1920s, boxers had demonstrated symptoms of CTE. Back then they called it punch drunk, the idea that you'd taken so many blows to the head that you had trouble with speech and motor function.
For them to be crown champ, they gotta fight me. The only way they're gonna make some real money is by fighting James Toney. I'm the $1 million man.
Hey, look, that don't matter. Kudo are improved. I mean, Canelo are improved.
This term was later changed to dementia pugilista when J.A. Millsbar felt the term punch drunk was too condescending to boxers. It was observed that many former fighters would have slurred speech, greatly decreased motor function, and long periods of time where they didn't really seem mentally present. Since it tended to be the boxers who were known for taking a lot of blows whose health descended this way, it was assumed that the condition was caused by excessive punching. Despite people recognizing this correlation, no further study was done and no warnings were given to boxers. At this stage, I want to quickly point out that there are hundreds of stories about CTE symptoms from the 1900s well into the 1950s, but because of the more basic medical care at the time, I'm not going to focus on those, even though I feel they are perfectly viable examples, because I know the fight fans in the audience will point to the poorer medical care of the time and say that's the reason why those guys were so fucked up. It's harder to dismiss the evidence when you use modern examples, which is why I'm placing the focus there. Fast forward a couple of decades to 1949, and McDonald Critchley wrote a paper titled Punch Drunk Syndromes, the Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy of Boxers, which explored the condition, its causes and symptoms further, and also gave it its current name. Then, nothing more was said about the condition for a long time, and it was widely considered to be a phenomenon restricted to just boxing.
And Simpson answered, and Probert got in another. Oh, and an uppercut landed from Probert, and now he's slugging away. Oh, a toe-to-toe slugfest. Simpson and Probert right at center ice.
In 1990, a rather strange case appeared. Dr. G.W. Roberts published a paper in The Lancet, in which he studied the brain of a recently deceased 76-year-old woman. The reason that it caught the attention of people was that the researchers noted that the various tests and scans showed damage to Wilma's brain which had the same morphological and immunological profile which had only been reported in dementia pugilista. She had a condition thought to be restricted to just boxers, only she didn't box. The patient was also noted as having historical injuries to the head which had resulted in cauliflower ears, which is the term given to when ears are permanently swollen and twisted from years of physical trauma, suggesting that Wilma had been a long-term victim of domestic abuse. She was found unconscious in her home with bruises to her head and face and broken ribs. Her medical file showed a 40-year history of behavior consistent with dementia. This was the first time any kind of medical practitioner or researcher had linked dementia pugilista with dementia outside of boxing. But it wouldn't be the last. Mike Webster was an NFL player who played predominantly for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Over a very long and successful career, Webster amassed a litany of awards and trophies for his efforts in the game. Mike played the position of center, which, if you're not an NFL fan, is a position which attracts a lot of aggression and heavy hits, because your job is basically to stand in front of the quarterback and protect him. Mike is considered by many to have been one of the finest players in his position in NFL history. He once played 150 consecutive games, only stopping for a dislocated elbow, which only kept him out for 4 games. Mike was as tough as they come. His 16-year career involved thousands of hits to all parts of his body, many of them his head. He carved out a reputation so tough that he was nicknamed Iron Mike before Iron Mike was Iron Mike. On one occasion, Mike had torn cartilage in his knee and needed crutches to walk. He turned up to a Steelers game, threw aside his crutches and played anyway, and then just went to surgery after. This image led to him being a highly celebrated sporting hero, the literal embodiment of a real man, a man who would play through injury and sacrifice everything for the glory of his team. A warrior. After retiring, Webster became something of an unusual figure. He had complained about chronic pain, would suffer periods of amnesia, and would live in his pickup truck despite teammates offering to rent apartments for him. He would sometimes stay in hotels paid for by Steelers owner Dan Rooney, but most of the time, Mike would just disappear and live like a vagabond instead. Mike became tormented by pain which wouldn't abate. Pain in his muscles, his bones, his head, which even high-dose opiate painkillers wouldn't take away. He also developed dementia as young as 40.
The things we do to one another, okay? Hell, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just tired and confused.
Over time, the symptoms of amnesia and dementia increased also, causing him to suffer from massive anxiety and depression. He'd be aggressive and confrontational even with the people who were his friends for little to no reason, and seemed to have a lot of trouble controlling his emotions and reactions. People found him sleeping in his car, not because he had nowhere to go, but because he couldn't remember how to get home, and sometimes he was parked outside it. In addition to crippling pain, searing headaches, depression, amnesia, and loss of motor control, Mike also began to experience periods of insomnia so bad that he would shock himself with electric stun guns, as it was the only way to force himself into unconsciousness.
He had a lot of pain, and he hasn't slept for days, so he asked me, says, "Sonny, can you tase me?" I'm like, "What does that mean?" So he pulls out the stun gun and goes, zzz, bzz. I'm like, "Mike, that's not healthy." He said, "But I haven't slept nothing." He said, "All you gotta do is tease me right here." And I'm like, "Okay, he's my hero. I'm gonna do whatever he tells me." So I teased him, and he goes to sleep.
Doctors were repeatedly surprised that sedatives, sleeping pills, antidepressants, and painkillers all had literally no effect on Mike at any dosage level. His aggressive and agitated behavior, coupled with lengthy disappearances, eventually led to his home being foreclosed and his wife leaving him. His son described seeing him physically convulsing from his condition so much that he would taser himself 10 or 20 times to stop it. Mike eventually ended up living in a furnitureless apartment with his son Garrett. Garrett detailed how he would often have to organize things for his dad because Mike was both physically and psychologically incapable of performing even basic tasks most of the time. One weekend, Mike was white as a ghost and his lips purple, but he refused to let Garrett take him to the hospital because he didn't have insurance. Eventually, he did end up at the hospital, where he fell into a coma and died of a heart attack. He was 50 years old when he died. Analysis of his brain showed that he was suffering from a very severe case of CTE. Bob Probert was drafted 46th in the '83 NHL draft by the Detroit Red Wings. Almost all of his time at Detroit was spent enforcing, which is using physical force to bully other players off their game, or literally knock them out by fighting them. By 1988, just 5 years into his professional career, Probert had been involved in over 30 fights and had already fixed himself in 6th place in the NHL all-time record for most penalty minutes received in a single season. Bob had been told that his value to the Red Wings was his level of violence and willingness to engage in it. Crowds cheered it, journalists celebrated it, and he'd been financially rewarded for it. Despite his violent persona on the ice, Bob was described as a very laid-back character off it by his wife. He would also support young kids in the community in playing hockey, would buy tickets to games for underprivileged kids that couldn't afford it, and also challenged a young fan to stay sober for longer than him in order to help the fan kick his habit. In 1989, Probert was arrested for cocaine possession and served time in jail, and was suspended by the NHL. Eventually, he was allowed to return after serving his sentence, and upon returning, he went right back to what he did best, and continued to use his aggression to dominate opponents until he retired. At the age of 40, he began to have memory lapses and mood swings.
I said he could remember games from 15 years ago, player who scored, if he's playing blackjack, who had what hand, who had what money, what the dealer had. But if you asked him what he had for breakfast that day, he couldn't remember.
While flipping through channels one day, a few years later, Bob saw a documentary talking about the analysis of former football players' brains. The researchers had mentioned that they were having trouble finding volunteers in sports to donate their brains. This prompted Bob to immediately volunteer. 6 months later, Bob died of a heart attack. He was 45 years old. Following his death, analysis of his brain showed that he did indeed have CTE. Aaron Hernandez was a professional NFL player who played for the New England Patriots. Unlike the others mentioned so far, he did not have a long career. His career lasted just 2 years before it was cut short by his arrest and conviction for murder. There's a documentary on Netflix about Aaron, so I won't go into too much detail about him, but he grew up in a house where his father beat him, he had a tense relationship with his mother, and a babysitter sexually abused him from a very young age. He grew up into a pretty talented football player, and much was expected of him. In his younger years, a high school coach noticed that Hernandez would often come to school with bruises around his eyes from where his father had beaten him when he was drunk. During a high school game, he was hit so hard by a blindside tackle that he was knocked completely unconscious, and an ambulance had to take him to hospital. Throughout high school and his time at Florida State University, he was repeatedly described as likable, fun, and life of the party by everyone who knew him. In high school, he was a B student with an unblemished disciplinary record. Despite being well liked and talented, he was hiding the fact that he was gay, and also using marijuana regularly. The Florida coach had wanted to drop Hernandez because of his chronic marijuana usage, but had been pressured to keep him in the team by the dean of the university to maintain the form of the football team, as Aaron was a star player. After his junior year, Hernandez was told to try for the NFL, because he would not be welcomed back at Florida State the following year. He got himself drafted and spent 2 years playing for the New England Patriots, where his behaviour off the field was often excused because of his talent on it. He would consistently get involved in physical altercations and be questioned multiple times in connection with various assaults. His Patriot teammates described him as difficult, while Tom Brady called him a lot to handle.
I'm trying to watch over Aaron and Brandon. Man, they're good guys. We got a lot to handle. Absolutely. Good luck the rest of the week.
Eventually, Hernandez was found guilty of murdering a friend called Odin Lloyd, a conviction which carried a life sentence without parole in Massachusetts. The Patriots immediately tore up his contract and removed all of his merchandise from shops within 90 minutes of him being charged with the murder. Interviews conducted in prison revealed that Hernandez had been suffering from intense migraines for quite a long time, which would sometimes be mentally crippling and cause him to lash out, and did not respond to any kind of painkiller. A short time after being incarcerated, Hernandez was found hanging from the window using bedsheets as a noose. He was 27 years old. Analysis of his brain after death showed that he had quite excessive case of CTE. Ilderaldo Bellini was a Brazilian soccer player who led Brazil to victory in 2 World Cups. Considered to be one of the best defenders in Brazilian national history, he was a gifted player and a well-liked teammate. In his youth, it was his excellent reading of the game and tactical awareness which led to him being named captain of the Brazilian national team. While he clearly had talents at his feet, it was his mind that was his real gift. When danger reared its head and his team were close to conceding, he would snuff out the danger before it ever really began by knowing and understanding where and when the danger was going to appear. Defenders in soccer tend to head the ball more than any other position as they try to keep attackers and their shots and long passes away from their goal. Back in the days when Bellini played, the ball was originally stitched together with heavy lacing and made one part of the ball very tough. So heading this older, tougher, heavier ball when it's launched at your face at 70 miles per hour could sometimes hurt. While he didn't suffer any kind of head injuries while playing the game or during his private life, after retirement, Bellini developed what people thought was early onset Alzheimer's. He would have problems with his memory, often believing himself to be in an earlier period of his life. His wife recalled that once he had asked a taxi driver to take him to practice in Sao Paulo. He was 50 years old at the time and had been retired for a couple of decades. For years, Bellini's memory issues were attributed to Alzheimer's, but after his death in 2014, researchers were given permission to study his brain to look at the effects of Alzheimer's on brain structure, and were surprised to learn he didn't have any of the hallmarks, signs, or associated structures of Alzheimer's in his brain tissue or his scans. He was 83 years old when he died, and in his 40s when first reporting symptoms. Analysis of his brain after death showed that he was suffering from CTE. Sports wrestling is basically a soap opera, designed for men. The stories are fake, the personas are mostly fake, and the outcomes of the matches are choreographed in advance. This is all true. But the damage that happens as a result of the actual moves in the ring is real. They get real debilitating injuries, torn muscles, broken legs and arms, internal bleeding, broken necks. It's a long list. The most common risk associated with professional wrestling is steroid abuse, and if we're totally honest, none of these guys got this jacked naturally. It's not even possible to get this jacked naturally. Steroid use is common. Chris Benoit was a Canadian wrestler who joined WWE in 2000 toward the end of the Attitude Era. Benoit spent years wrestling in Japan and Extreme Championship Wrestling before ending up in WWE. Both of these franchises had a reputation for high-risk acrobatics where wrestlers would engage in very physically demanding and dangerous stunts to please a baying crowd, which, I imagine, is why WWE was so quick to secure his services. During his time with ECW, Chris accidentally broke another wrestler's neck when that wrestler changed his position mid-move, which made him land on his neck. Later, Benoit was found devastated in the locker room at the thought that he might have paralyzed someone, showing that he wasn't actually a psychopath, he did have a conscience. His time in the WWE was filled doing more of the same high-flying, high-risk but ultimately very entertaining maneuvers. Chris made his way up the ranks in WWE, eventually winning almost every possible championship available. He was talented, well-paid, popular, and famous. But not everything was quite so hunky-dory behind the scenes. In 2000, round about the same time that Benoit joined WWE, Chris married his then wife Nancy, but just 3 years later she filed for divorce, citing his aggressive and destructive behaviour as the reason, reporting that he would smash up furniture in a rage and treat her cruelly, though she didn't specify how. She later dropped the divorce application and they stayed married together. In 2005, Chris's close friend Eddie Guerrero was found dead in his home. His diary was said to contain multiple entries about how hard he took the death. Midway through June 2007, WWE asked the police in Georgia to conduct a welfare check on Benoit after he failed to show up for work without giving any notice. Officers entered the property and found the bodies of Benoit, his wife Nancy, and his son Daniel in the home. Nancy had been dead and smothered, and he had choked his son to death before hanging himself. Toxicology reports would show that Nancy had recreational doses of Xanax, 2 opiate derivative painkillers in her system. Daniel had Xanax in his system, which led investigators to believe that Benoit had dosed them both to make them easier to control and less likely to resist. He then took similar doses of the same medications before ending his own time on this planet. His report stated that he also had a slightly elevated level of synthetic testosterone in his system, but the medical examiner also stated that he did not believe the dosage to be high enough to induce any kind of violent behavior. Even the link between steroids and violent behavior is a tenuous one. He was 40 years old when he died. Analysis of his brain after death showed he had an extremely severe case of CTE. Micky Ward's life story is the subject of the movie The Fighter, starring Christian Bale and Mark Wahlberg. He was a championship-winning boxer who was known for being involved in some of the most brutal fights in boxing history. After his fight with Arturo Gatti, they were both so beaten and broken that they had to spend weeks in a trauma center. Micky retired in 2003 and has since been training fighters in his gym in Lowell. Most boxers are very resistant to blaming their time in the ring for any health problems they might have. Muhammad Ali and his family have always insisted that him developing Parkinson's in his mid-30s had no connection to boxing at all, even though the odds of Parkinson's that young are extremely slim, and 90% of Parkinson's cases begin developing symptoms after their 50th birthday, whereas Ali was said to have symptoms in his 30s. One thing which is quite remarkable about Micky is how candid he is about the condition that boxing has left him in.
Well, I'm diagnosed with the signs of CTE. It's terrible. It's like, it makes you nauseous almost. It's like just a thump in the back of my head, the side. And you just feel like drained all day, you know. And
they don't know how bad you have it, but they know if you got signs of it. And you know, Dr. Robert Cantu from Boston Medical, he's my doctor, and Chris Nowinski, the one that's that. Oh, yeah. You know, I'm good. I try to be. I eat pretty good. I don't drink no more. You know what I mean?
Good for you.
Yeah, because of the headaches that I get from the CTE, and if I drink, forget it, you know?
Searing headaches which painkillers can't remove, issues with his memory, and daily nausea that wakes him up at night. Micky never had headaches and nausea after his punishing fights in the ring, but they're now happening multiple times per week and have been increasing in both severity and frequency over time, leaving him worried what kind of condition he may have in the future.
But only one player in the entire conference was a unanimous Pro Bowl selection. Linebacker, Junior Seau.
Oh my God, ma'am. My boyfriend shot him to me. Ma'am, can you take a deep breath for me? And it's your boyfriend? Yes. Do you know if he's breathing? I don't think so. Okay. Where is the gun? It's next to him in the bed. What is your boyfriend's name? Junior Seau. Okay, it's Junior Seau.
After the finish of the First World War, many vets returned home to try and live a happy and peaceful life. However, many of those returning vets found that they had trouble when they came back. Despite being in more serene environments with their loved ones, they found that they couldn't relax, felt continually and increasingly more nervous. Their hands would shake and they would get searing headaches which no painkiller could resolve. Some of those would also begin rapidly losing their memory, losing control of their emotions, and begin to have very confusing and mixed up chronology. They would suffer from mood disorders and also have long bouts of insomnia. At the time, this was called shell shock, and attributed to the psychological effects of being on battlefields, where constant explosions from repeated and continuous shelling of the ground around them. The same thing happened after World War II, though they replaced the term with combat stress reaction, and also began to insinuate that soldiers were just making it up to avoid conflict and future enlistment. After the Gulf War, soldiers again came back with the same symptoms. The increased use of psychology at this point saw the term Gulf War Syndrome being used to clinically describe the collection of symptoms, but they still hadn't really connected the dots as to why so many ex-military staff suffered crippling illnesses, became violent, and lost their memory. While not much research has been conducted on the subject, there have been some studies which show that domestic violence rates in military personnel increase after deployment, as does alcohol and drug abuse problems. For a very long time, medicine and science in general has been unable to explain why this happens, or why patients who were treated with medication for pain and mood disorders have no response to the medication regardless of dosage. Football stars, professional wrestlers, ice hockey enforcers, boxers, soccer players, domestic abuse victims, and ex-soldiers whose medical condition and symptoms are linked together by one thing: violence. Their slow descent into mental and physical torture, which medicine doesn't seem to have an answer for, is caused by chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But what is CTE? CTE is a degenerative brain condition caused by repeated blows to the head over time. Current research believes it's not so much the strength of the blow, it's repeated blows which are the problem. In fact, you're far more likely to develop CTE from repeated mild blows over time than from 3 or 4 very strong blows. This is what a normal brain looks like. Here is an elderly chap with Alzheimer's, and here's an elderly man with Parkinson's disease. Now this one is a brain with CTE. If this image doesn't scare you, I can only assume it's because you're not really sure what you're looking at. As science has only really been seriously studying the condition for a short time, there isn't really a solid proposed mechanism of action for the condition. But it's proposed that when external force hits the skull, that force then travels through the cerebral spinal fluid. The fluid can't compact due to there being no space there, so the force is transferred through the fluid and into the caverns of the brain, which are called sulci. This causes tissue at the site to shear and tear. This then releases tau proteins into the vascular compartment and the central spinal fluid. The proteins then generate an antibody response, essentially telling the immune system to attack its own brain. It also blocks blood vessels, cutting off supply to some sections of the brain, which leads to those sections actually dying. Which is what you're seeing in this image here. This brain hasn't simply shrunk, some of it has actually died. With each blow, this happens twice. Once from the initial impact, and then when the head rocks in the opposite direction from the impact, and then it stops. And again, on the opposite side of the brain, when the head returns to its original position. The reasons why medium and low impact hits cause CTE are because it's a cumulative effect. Each small blow or bump can cause this stretching and tearing of the sulci and a small buildup of tau protein at the site. Each blow builds up more and more, and a key factor in why this is more common with repeated soft blows is because when you receive a hard blow, it causes clinical problems. Either you get knocked out and taken for medical help, or you get a concussion and receive medical help. Either way, you're removed from the situation which is causing the damage because you're aware that it has caused a problem. But when the blows are small and produce no observable immediate clinical symptoms, you keep playing, accumulating more and more tears in your brain tissue and building it up bit by bit, that very damaging tau protein in your brain, which is going to slowly and literally strangle the blood supply, leading to parts of your brain dying. There it sits, in your brain, prompting the immune system to attack the surrounding structures, slowly degrading the tissue over time. You won't even know that you have a problem until you start to get symptoms, and by that point, it's about 10 years too late. CTE is categorized in 4 stages, 1 being the least degenerative damage and 4 being the highest level of degenerative damage. Stage 1 has a small buildup of tau proteins around the frontal lobe and the crown of the head, which begins to restrict blood vessels, leading to the brain shrinking a very tiny amount. There are, however, only minor symptoms: headaches, mild confusion, and dizziness for intermittent periods of time. In stage 2, the tau buildup begins to degrade the frontal lobe of the brain. This leads to impulsivity control issues, inability to control anger, some memory loss, and very poor judgment. At stage 3, the tau protein starts to expand and affect the temporal portions of the brain. This affects the hippocampus and the amygdala, parts of the brain which control behaviors related to fear responses, learning, and memory. This leads to dementia, speech impediments, tremors, vertigo, depression, suicidal ideation, and increased violent aggression. In stage 4, the tau has now totally overwhelmed the brain, blocked blood vessels, making the brain shrink to half its size. It's also brittle and hugely deformed with large cavernous holes throughout. This causes all the same symptoms as stage 3, but with constant searing headaches, inability to swallow, extreme periods of amnesia, and as a special bonus, medications for pain and sedation cannot be given to CTE patients due to their mechanism of action in the brain. So whatever pain a CTE patient experiences can't be stopped. The insomnia they suffer can't be treated with drugs to make them sleep, Any depression or anxiety is completely unaffected by medication because they all act on different levels of neurotransmitters in the brain, which are also affected by the tau protein buildup. The only way to currently conclusively diagnose CTE is dissecting the brain once the patient has died and identifying protein deposits. You could look at a CT or fMRI scan for structural deformities in the brain, but by that point it's already too late. This also isn't definitive, as some other degenerative brain disorders like Alzheimer's have both symptom and structural similarities, so it's very easy to misdiagnose. In stage 1, it's almost impossible to detect, as no structures have been deformed and they won't show up on a scan. Symptoms are also mild enough that you would very easily dismiss them as everyday illnesses like flu or headaches or anything minor. In stage 2, you'd very likely just diagnose the problem as a mental health disorder and you'd treat and prescribe for it accordingly, expecting that you could probably manage the illness that way. By stage 3, the doctor is probably going to assume some kind of reduced brain function or brain disorder, and they're going to send you for a scan. And at that point they may diagnose Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, as they both look similar to CTE on the scan. By stage 4, you're very likely going to need to be institutionalized or require round-the-clock care, because you're going to be a mere shadow of who you once were. The diagnosis of CTE is very hard because the clinical symptoms have crossover with two very similar degenerative brain conditions in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Alzheimer's almost universally only happens in people over the age of 65, with a very tiny minority getting it early in their 40s. Parkinson's is very similar, with the condition beginning over 50 and a small group experiencing it when they're in their 40s. Most people are aware of Parkinson's thanks to Michael J. Fox and Muhammad Ali, who were both diagnosed with the condition. People with Parkinson's do tend to be able to manage some of the symptoms with medication, as in the case of Michael J. Fox, whose symptoms have been helped thanks to the medication. The medication for Parkinson's acts on neurotransmitters in the brain. Muhammad Ali struggled quite badly with his Parkinson's, and some medication did help him regain some motor function and lessen his tremors, but it didn't really help with some of the other neurological conditions like his memory loss and speech. This could simply have been that at the point when those medications had been invented, his condition was too far gone. But what if the reason that Ali didn't respond the same way as other sufferers was because he didn't have Parkinson's, but instead had CTE? Now, officially it was diagnosed as early onset Parkinson's, which is definitely not impossible. There are people who develop it young, but it's exceptionally rare. Ali himself, people associated with boxing, his family, and all his physicians insist it was Parkinson's. Their basis for this is his responsiveness to a Parkinson's drug and scans from 1995, along with physical exams. Ali declined to donate his brain to science so they could check it for CTE, which is currently the only definitive way to know. So their pool of data isn't exactly conclusive, and the doctors themselves admit that the medication did not help his memory issues or his minor mood problems. Memory loss and mood disorders are also much less common symptoms of Parkinson's, and Ali was never diagnosed with Parkinson's dementia. There is a lot of overlap between symptoms of CTE and Parkinson's. However, it's much more common to get memory and mood disorder symptoms from CTE. It's more common that CTE affects younger people. In fact, it mostly affects people around 35 to 45 years old. There's a correlation between Parkinson's and traumatic brain injury, and experts say that it increases the risk of Parkinson's by about 50%. In CTE, it's 100%. That is to say that 100% of CTE cases involve traumatic brain injury. And let's consider when it began to affect Ali. Symptoms were first detected in his mid-30s, which is 6 years or so after his brutal fight with Joe Frazier. A fight in which Ali took repeated headshots from one of the hardest left hooks in boxing, which eventually floored Ali. A fight which Ali himself described as the closest to death he had ever been. Prior to that fight, Ali rarely received much punishment due to the fact that he had excellent feet and reflexes and evaded punches pretty effectively. But a stint away from boxing while he was banned cost him his speed and reflexes through lack of competition. And when he came back to fight Frazier at 29 years old, he was a lot less mobile than he had been in his earlier years, and so took many headshots in that fight. Not too long after, People would begin to notice Ali would slur his words.
Floyd Patterson and other fighters, they just don't take part. They make $1 million, they get them a Rolls Royce, they get them a nice home, they get them a white wife.
Yes, if I could discover the fountain of youth and go back about 5 years, I would have a little more left, but at 37 years old.
Nice homes, I'm faster. Just studied my top-notch fighter, 22 years old, 6'2", I'm faster. Marty Monroe, world 8th ranked heavyweight.
Ring physicians noted that pre-fight examinations revealed that he had some cognition problems and uncoordinated movements. His famous quick wit also began to leave him too. That's a very rapid decline in such a short time span, and Parkinson's usually takes 10 to 20 years to progress to this stage. In all likelihood, it could be that Ali did have extremely rare, very rapidly declining Parkinson's. But looking at the evidence, CTE is a better fit. But if it was CTE, why would everyone involved state so vehemently that it was Parkinson's? Parkinson's has a very strong genetic component, meaning that in most cases of Parkinson's, there's a family history of it, and it's very likely passed down. Why would that matter in Ali's case, considering he did not have a family history of Parkinson's? The answer to the question of why everyone would say that Ali had Parkinson's is that if it's Parkinson's, they can blame genetics. If it was CTE, then they have no choice but to admit that boxing is the problem. But I don't want to pick on just boxing here. Ice hockey has a history of denying CTE. For a very long time, they wouldn't even acknowledge that hits to the head and fighting were a problem. In fact, it took the greatest young player since Wayne Gretzky to suffer repeated concussion problems and miss almost 2 years of games for the league to finally admit that perhaps the violence in hockey was something they needed to look at. In the years since CTE became a more widely known phenomenon, former players who weren't even enforcers or physical or even really that aggressive like Henri Richard or Stan Mikita had their brains studied after they died, both having battled dementia for most of their post-hockey lives, and both had stage 3 CTE acquired from playing hockey.
I don't believe there has been, based on everything I've been told, and if anybody has information to the contrary, we'd be happy to hear it. Other than some anecdotal evidence, there has not been that conclusive link.
But no matter who sits in the NHL chairman's chair, they all deny the link between hockey violence and long-term brain damage, because if you take away the violence of hockey, the belief is that it would be less popular. People enjoy the physical nature of the sport, and taking it away is also taking money away from the people who profit from the sport. The NFL did something even worse. When Bennett Omalu first tried to publish his findings, the NFL actively campaigned against Omalu and called his research junk science. They also chased him out of his job and painted him as the man who wanted to cancel NFL. They questioned his credentials due to him being from Nigeria, even though he earned most of his 7 advanced degrees in the United States. They did everything they could to dismiss him for almost a decade. It took the NFL until 2009 to finally admit that there might be a link between the violence of football and the high incidence of brain disease in former players. And in 2016, when Congress asked the senior VP for health and safety of the NFL if football caused CTE, he admitted that yes, the NFL does recognize that a career in football can lead to CTE.
Do you think there is a link between football and degenerative brain disorders like CTE?
Dr. Mickey's research shows that a number of retired NFL players are diagnosed with CTE, so the answer to that question is certainly yes.
Only took them 40 years to admit it. Even a sport as non-aggressive as soccer has a growing issue with Alzheimer's, with ex-players being 3.5 times more likely to develop it. It's described in soccer as a crisis, with many former players worried about developing the condition. While in the past the sport has been keen to label it as dementia and link it to genetics, just like boxing did, that is changing now, thanks to former players who've donated their brains to study after they died, and they were found to have varying stages of CTE. I've resisted talking about UFC until now, because UFC is a little bit different than the others. While it has its resistance to medical diagnoses, with even former champion BJ Penn saying CTE is fake, one of the dumbest takes I've ever heard in my life, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter. By and large, UFC has actually tried to treat the subject a little more seriously and openly than pretty much any other sport. This is largely because of its beginnings. In the start, UFC was insanely brutal. This is an early fight in which one fighter was kicked so hard his actual teeth flew out of his mouth and onto the commentator table. When the sport started to gain notoriety for its violence and the government began to make noise about banning UFC in all states, the people in charge realized that they needed some regulation in order to stop them being banned, so they instituted safety changes to avoid the ban. A few years later, and Dana White would buy the sport, and further rule changes were introduced for safety reasons, rule changes which were agreed upon with other regulators too. These rule changes even earned the approval of Senator John McCain, who had been the UFC's nemesis, and the one leading the charge to ban the sport.
Martial arts, I think at one point you talked about it being even banned. These sports growing on you? Are you warming up to them?
I think very popular. And they've cleaned up their act enormously. Actually, this ultimate fighting now isn't a heck of a lot different from boxing. So they have changed dramatically. But what it was at the beginning was human cockfighting. It was.
How fair do you think the criticism was then?
I think it was very fair. We didn't disagree with McCain or any of the other people.
Outside of Fight Island, I wanted to ask you, a big article came out this week about Spencer Fisher. He's kind of gone public, I guess, with everything that he's been dealing with, potential CTE.
Listen, we're all learning every day about the brain injury stuff, you know? We've been invested in this Ruvo Center. He's not the first, and he's definitely not going to be the last. I mean, this is a contact sport, and anybody who's ever done this younger, myself included, is dealing with brain issues. It's part of the gig.
It's interesting when looking at the response UFC and Dana White has, because there's no denial at all there. And while there could be more done, the fact that he is both not denying its existence like every other sport, and also taking some admittedly small steps to mitigate it, is positive. Because it's a very young organisation, there isn't any institutional resistance against progress or rule changes. In all other sports, there's always some dinosaur saying changing the rules will ruin the sport. They don't really care about the risk to the athlete, or at the very least they care more about making money than they do about the risk to the athlete. I'm not really a fan of UFC. I'm not ideologically opposed to it in any way. I just don't find it all that entertaining, despite having a martial arts background myself. But I do have to give UFC credit for dealing with the issue head on, and at least trying to understand it. UFC has a high number of fighters suffering from fighting-related brain damage, so it owes a duty of care to any fighters past, present and future to understand the risks involved. I just wish other sports would give the issue the same weight and consideration. I think that it's important to understand what CTE is like from the perspective of los síntomas se pensa que ruim.
Quiet slivers of a much larger narrative, with the goal being to build a future that's rich and distinct.
As people, we have a tendency to detach ourselves from events that we're unrelated to. It's why many people can see programs or commercials about people
and whatever you did to me is still happening to me because I keep thinking snuff.
It's a preservation mechanism designed to limit the amount of trauma that we experience.
But there's a lot of guys out there that don't remember their own name or...
Without hesitation, Stephen slowly and purposefully looks straight into the detective. Quando contraemo alguém que conhecem contrai. At the start of this section, I asked you a question. What is that final number? If that section left you feeling confused, irritated, frustrated, then you've had a very narrow glimpse at daily life as someone with CTE. What makes it worse is that it's a degenerative condition, so maybe at first you're just a little bit forgetful and have the occasional headache. But over time, more and more symptoms occur more and more frequently and more severely, where you might get to the point that you decide taking your own life is better than living with this condition. And that's if you still have the cognitive ability to take your own life. By that point, you might be cognitively incapable. CTE patients are 67% more likely to suffer from depression. They're 56% more likely to attempt suicide, and 27% of them actually do take their own life to stop their suffering. Remember, no drugs can help. No painkiller removes the pain, no mood modulator takes away your feelings of despair and anguish. There's no drug that helps to rebuild your memory. There's no drug that prevents the buildup of tau protein in your brain, and there's no type of surgery that can reverse any of its effects. It is a stochastic effect. Once it happens, there's no way to reverse it. And one of the misunderstandings of the condition is that it's kind of like having a broken skull or a ruptured tendon. There's the injury, and then a period of healing, and then a period of athletic recovery, and then you're fine. But the process of CTE never heals, ever. Every blow creates those tears in the brain tissue. Every hit releases tau protein into the surrounding area. That protein never goes away. To try and simplify what this means, imagine that this imaginary line here represents Alzheimer's symptoms as a result of CTE. Each punch fills up that bar. Some punches fill it up faster, some slower, but each and every blow fills up that bar and it never gets emptied. Then one day, there's too much tau protein in your brain and it cuts off the blood supply and parts of your brain die and it shrinks. Now suddenly, you can't take care of yourself, and that career which brought you so much glory is something you can't even remember. Everybody has different limits because we all have different genetics. But make no mistake, everyone has that limit. It's easy to understand why the varying sports and their regulatory bodies have little to no interest in changing anything, or even admitting that there's a problem. There's a huge amount of money on the line that they might potentially sacrifice by making changes. But why do people engage in these sports, even though there's a pretty high risk of getting brain damage by the time you're 40? I think there are a few reasons for this. The optimism bias is a psychological mechanism in which the sufferer always believes good things will happen for them and that bad things won't. It's extremely common. Roughly 1 billion people engage in this bias every single day when they smoke, even though there's a pretty high risk of cancer. Millions of gamblers gamble every day, believing they'll win and they won't lose. I think many fighters just assume that it won't happen to them. Playing into this is that many fighters assume they're good enough that it won't happen. But as we've seen, even the greatest boxer of all time suffered brain damage from boxing. That's even if you accept the official diagnosis of Parkinson's. His own doctors do admit boxing contributed to it. Generational talent like Sidney Crosby have had issues with it, and even soccer players in the top 2% of their position suffer from it. So the idea that someone is good enough to avoid it is very faulty. What Dana White said is true.
Anybody who's ever done this is dealing with brain issues. It's part of the gig.
And I applaud him for being so honest and blunt about it. Sunk cost fallacy is when someone continues to do something which is not giving the desired result because they've already invested time and or money into it and they don't want to lose that time and money. A lot of people who dedicate themselves to a sport do so from a very young age, so by the time they're old enough to understand the risks of the sport, they're very unlikely to reject it because their entire life and personality revolves around that sport. Sometimes their entire family's income revolves around their participation in that sport. This kind of ties in with the optimism bias, since everybody who becomes a professional athlete needs to hold some belief that they'll be successful and rich as a result of their talent. But of course, that's not really the case. The median salary for an NFL player is about $860,000, which of course sounds like a lot of money, but when you factor in taxes, agent fees, management fees, and expenses, it's a lot less. And that figure isn't permanent either. Sports careers end before the age of 40, which means whatever you have accrued up until that point, you need to live on for the next 30 years. It's a similar story in other sports too. Those at the very tippy top, the top 1 to 3%, end up obscenely wealthy while everyone else earns a lot less. That career can also be cut short by other injuries at any time. Now, a lot of people would say that the risk is worth being rich, But if you've lost your memory by the age of 50, then what good is being rich if you can't even remember that you're rich? Male culture in general has a very pervasive notion that injury is weakness, talking is weakness, pain is weakness, and all of these are signs of someone who is a failure as a man in general. This type of incredibly toxic and dangerous thinking is all over social media, thanks to certain individuals. It's an extremely counterproductive mentality and it leads to very serious problems. I could make a whole video about how psychological health among men in general is woefully underexplored and underreported precisely because real men are expected to be silent and stoic. They're expected to just suck it up and live through the pain, which when you compete in a violent and aggressive sport 2 or 3 times a week is insanely damaging mentality. And what makes it worse is that not only are men who get seriously injured and quit ridiculed for doing so, but when they play through the pain and injury, it's celebrated and they're branded as real men and warriors. But where are those people when you have brain damage, long-term skeletal damage, devastated tendons? There's no crowd cheering for you then. People forget about you, and they hide you from view because people don't want to accept that being a warrior often reduces you to a physically and mentally incapable toddler needing round-the-clock care. Every single contact sport cultivates a culture of playing through, with players often being encouraged to just ignore the pain, even when the injury is horrific. And the denial often continues after retirement. And I can understand that. It must be really hard to admit that the thing that you dedicated your entire life to, that thing which has made you rich and popular and successful, is also the reason that you can't remember your kids' names or where you live. In this UFC clip of a fighter taking a truly brutal and illegal knee to the face, he could and should have ended the fight and seen medical attention. But instead of being concerned for his health, literally everyone applauded him for continuing to fight on and receive even more punishment.
I want to say this though, because this is something that's coming up and it's actually kind of pissing me off.
What's that?
There's a bunch of people that have been saying, should Anthony Smith have laid down after he took that illegal knee and won the title?
Who said this?
Ariel Helwani. A bunch of other people said it. I think Ariel was suggesting or asking whether or not he should have.
That's some beta male shit.
Well, it's crazy because the guy should be praised for he ate the knee, he was okay, and then he wasn't even thinking about quitting.
We should all give him praise for this. I was like,
this habit of being tough and hiding injuries is a very dangerous mentality in any contact sport. I think the main reason that people still enter contact sports despite the risk is that they either don't really know the risk or they don't really understand it. Many times people will say things like, we all have to die sometime, or I'm tough, I can take it, both of which are rife with misunderstandings. You probably won't die from your chosen sport, and most people aren't really afraid of dying anyway. They're far more afraid of having a poor quality of life. The whole point in going into these sports is to avoid a poor quality of life. And rather than losing your life in pursuit of glory, you'll be racked with searing head pain every day. You'll be unable to sleep and feel depressed and intensely sad for no reason. And the glory days that you fought so hard for will become a hazy and difficult to recall alien experience that feels like a barely remembered TV show from a long time ago. Dying isn't the problem. Living with brain damage is. It's really easy to tell someone the symptoms of any illness, but the fact that it's never been properly demonstrated and people have no experience with it means that it can feel kind of detached and difficult to connect with. The reason why cancer patients suddenly start to campaign for cancer research is that they become acutely aware of just how bad the experience is because they lived it. I imagine that a lot of people understood that radiation was really bad for the human body, but many of those people didn't realize just how bad it was until they watched my video on Hisashi Ouchi and saw that it's truly a horrifying and torturous experience. And I think the same can be said for CTE. The reason why it's not a bigger, more talked about issue is because people are lacking the context for it. You might think from the severity and tone of the video that I'm going to suggest banning sports or banning aspects of those sports, but I don't think that's the answer. Coming from a medical background, I have, a somewhat good understanding of what informed consent means, and that's what's lacking from sport. If someone has a CT scan, for example, the radiographer has to make the patient aware that both the scan and the radiation reactive contrast medium that's going to be injected into their veins can cause them some harm, and then allow the patient to decide for themselves if the risk is worth it. Medical staff don't even really use terms like safe or unsafe anyway, because nothing in medicine can be guaranteed to be safe. Instead, they'll ask what the risk to benefit ratio is, and then decide if it's worth proceeding based on that. I think educating people who enter a given sport and spending time with someone who is currently suffering with the kind of brain damage that they could possibly acquire is what's needed. There also needs to be better safeguards around allowing people to continue when they're showing signs of said brain damage. Muhammad Ali's physicians said that he constantly struggled and sometimes failed with neurological exams, but he was cleared to fight anyway. Competitors themselves will also put themselves at higher risk by hiding symptoms and tricking the tests to continue.
I called the doctor and said, yeah, you got a detached retina. They fixed that, it redetached, I got glaucoma. It was just bad luck, one thing after the other. Anything that could go wrong with an eye went wrong.
How did you get to the point where you're fighting GSP? Like, how did you pass this test?
With great difficulty. Lying, cheating, bullshit codes. I fucking lied to so many doctors.
Or they might even admit that there is a problem but soldier on with it because that's what real men do, without realizing the only person who will lose in that scenario is them, and they'll become a burden on their families like Mike Webster did. Nobody, myself included, wants to see these sports disappear. I'm a huge hockey and soccer fan, and I'd hate to see the sports disappear. But more than that, I don't want to see the people who I've cheered and celebrated become drooling, rambling shadows of their previous selves with no memory of who they used to be. I genuinely can't think of a crueler life for someone who was a pillar of strength and success to not be able to remember any of it and to be in physical and psychological pain every single day. The sad truth is, headgear, gloves, lighter balls, more stringent rules on checking and fighting can't stop the damage from happening. It will happen. The question really is how much damage will happen, and if you really understood what you were going to sacrifice before you sacrificed it. And that's why I made this video, to increase the awareness and education on the topic of acquired brain damage in sports, because on all levels, from sports organizers all the way down to competitors themselves, there really is a massive lack of understanding of what it can mean and what you're going to sacrifice in the pursuit of glory. If you really think about it, memories are what make us who we are. Empathy stems from memories, identity stems from memories. You can make an argument that the human soul, if there is one, is contained within your memories. And that's why people who don't have memories anymore often seem like empty, hollow husks. So to lose your memories is like losing your soul. And I think that's a price that you should know that you need to pay before you need to pay it.
Hello. So what this is me explaining what's wrong with me. I've been depressed for a long time. My head is pretty messed up and damaged. The voices and demons in my head just started to take over everything I wanted to do. I took a lot of hits through football. Took a lot of concussions. And a lot of times I never told anybody about how I was feeling in my head after a hit. I just kind of kept playing, which was not smart on my end, I know that. Dad, I know you're capable of doing this, and I want you to do it. After my funeral, which will be an open casket, I want my brain donated to be studied. I feel like it'll be closure for me, and it'll be closure for you guys to know that maybe Wyatt suffered from brain damage. Maybe that was the reason. So do that for yourself. I would like that to be done. I want you all to be happy that I'm free and then I can rest easy, because my life for the past 4 years has been living hell inside of my head. I love you, and goodbye.